by Dr. Spector to be on this panel, I was very excited, and I'm very honored to be on this panel. Then I started thinking about historical analysis, and then I realized it's because some of us have lived some of the history. So there it is. For example, when I was a doctoral student, I did M1 tank maintenance training using the ticket system. So that was super exciting. Another thing I wanted to mention is, although I've been in our field for over 30 years, I've done evaluation for over 30 years, so that's my topic, which is implementation and evaluation. Still, for those of you who are students, I still went to books, and I thought, oh my gosh. One of my students roasted me many years ago, a couple of our students. If you've ever not been roasted as a professor, it's very exciting. So what they said was, and Willie comes to class with a cart full of stuff and a small animal. So one of the things I wanted to mention is the trends in the field. And so as we look at the field, why do we evaluate? And it comes, and the reason this talk is last is because we think about how do we know what our success is? What is success? And it's evidence-based. So as Dr. Spector said, which I think he may be online, I'm not sure, you get what you measure, and based on what I think is, if you don't measure, how will you ever know where you are? How do you know if you're successful? And how are you going to improve? So I think of that as sort of simple. When I think of evaluation, I work with a lot of people who are not educators in engineering or in museums and botanical gardens. And I say, you need to collect data to make a difference. So what we do is we collect data as evaluators. In our case, it's about instructional programs, courses, whole series of courses within universities, training programs in business. So what we're doing is we're collecting data that turns into information, and we want somebody to use the information. So we help decision makers. So the trend in higher ed right now is to talk about evidence-based, and certainly in the medical field, where a lot of it came from. We think about collecting data to make a difference. So it's a little bit different from research. Sometimes I'll tell students when I teach evaluation, it's a kind of research, it's underneath research, however you want to look at it. But research answers questions, so we collect data to answer questions. We also, as evaluators, collect data to answer questions, but it's because we want somebody to do something with the data. So you are hoping, as an evaluator, that your data are used, and generally you want the data to be used to improve a program. I'll give you an example from the zoo. By the way, when you work on, nowadays, early on when I was doing evaluation, a lot of the federal and state projects didn't necessarily require a lot of evaluation. Then that's one of the trends throughout history, as it's become more and more expected. At times, the NSF, for example, has said they want experiments. That's not always possible in our settings, but we can find sort of equivalent control groups and so on in terms of research. But a little example is, I worked with the zoo in Phoenix, and they were evaluating, oh, you'll love this one. It was the reptile house at the zoo. The education director said, well, we're out of money. Nobody listened to me about some things in the design, so I'm bringing in an outside expert, and I want you to do an evaluation. And Heidi Schnackenberg, who's a professor now herself, helped me do this evaluation of what people were doing with the reptile house to try to fix it. So here's an example of heavy duty, I'll show you complex evaluation in a minute, heavy duty evaluation. So the reptile house had windows here, and a few windows here. Who goes to zoos? Kids and families, right? The windows are here, bottom of the window. What's the problem with the windows?
Kids down there.
So you're watching parents, and we did it scientifically. We had a method I learned from Chandler Scriven and Bitgood in museum work. We counted how many people crossed a line, what they did, what they said. Then we would take the next group, and lo and behold, parents had to lift the kids to see the animals. So in some ways you'd say, well, that's not rocket science, but he needed data to help him. So then I thought, okay, I turned in my report, what's going to happen? I'm a member of the zoo. So Heidi and I later went there a little bit later. So they didn't have any money. So what do you think he did? Cinder blocks. He put cinder blocks onto the windows so both the parents and the kids could see. So that's one of my favorite stories in terms of evaluation, is you collect data that you hope will make a difference. Granted, sometimes it's a tech report, goes on your resume, it gets stored somewhere. But we tend to want, as evaluators, to make a difference. So we make a presentation, we do like 100-page report, and then we make a 1-pager that someone will actually read, and we try to do a briefing so that people will make a difference, or your evaluation will make a difference. So what I wanted to mention a little bit today in terms of where we are. It's a super exciting time. Those of you who have been in the field a long time, we've seen ebbs and flows in instructional technology, we've seen ebbs and flows in evaluation. It's a really cool time for those of you who are starting out. I think, as you said, if you're 20 or 30, it's a great time. Our field is interdisciplinary. So we have instructional media, as Dr. Clark said, we have science-based collection of data about instructional media or the technologies or the machines. We have instructional design, but we also have the learning sciences influencing our field and vice versa, human performance technology, and all the technology affordances that those of us who were young at one time dreamed of. Well, those things are possible now. It doesn't mean that good things are being made, and that's where you would come in as an evaluator. So hopefully you're doing what Scriven called formative evaluation. So you're collecting data while something is being developed so you can make a difference. Summative evaluation is when the project's completed, and that's often where we do the report. So the fun part is, of course, if you've done formative evaluation, you fixed at least whatever you could, it works better. Your summative report looks pretty good because you fixed a lot on the way and you made a big difference. It's pretty hard to do that sometimes in industrial settings where a lot of us have worked as well, because there's not a lot of time. So you try to build in the evaluation time as part of the development time if they don't necessarily see it as separate, and it's just part of it. So I'll give you a few quotes from a little bit of history. And I will put up, I know I got an email before the conference, there is a place to put up handouts and PowerPoints, and I do have a handout, and I'll add a few references if you're fairly new to evaluation. So here's a quote: "Evaluation is a burgeoning field." Well, what's really scary is this is from a textbook I studied with by Popham, 1975. So it is a burgeoning field. What you're seeing now, I got a chance to go to the American Evaluation Association conference last year. Tremendous excitement. Lots of people are doing evaluation, and by the way, I had one course in evaluation. I had it from Howard Sullivan, so I was pretty good, right? Many of us have done it as part of being designers and end up liking evaluation, and we like research. But when I was at AEA, I went to an interest group of people starting businesses, and a lot of them are not trained evaluators. They're just starting. So it's still a burgeoning field. There's lots of opportunity. 1975 to now, kind of the same. Little bit of history though, and this is kind of fun. So as I thought about this, several authors have said, well, we could look at 4,000 years ago, because the Chinese used tests for public administrators to see if they were good enough. People could say that Socrates and the Greeks and the Romans also used testing and evaluation. The early movement started, some people would argue, in the 1880s with Rice, who studied the spelling performance of about 30,000 students, if I've got that right. Tyler, who some call the father of educational objectives in the 30s, that makes a difference to us as instructional technologists because we want to know where we're going. Otherwise, what are we going to measure? What's the point of measuring? So we tend to, as evaluators, say, we don't always say, what are your objectives, right? We say, what do you want people to come out with? What does success look like to you? And then we start inferring objectives if it's an instructional program. So educational evaluation in the early stages was really heavily focused on testing, very quantitative. In World War I, there was great need for tests of people to determine where they were going to go. Our field also developed a lot in World War II in terms of technology development. Here's another one, and both our presenters talked about teaching machines. So Pressey, here's a quote from an even older book, and Pressey said, "When the father of the teaching machine becomes critical of the movement that fosters its use, we should pay attention to his statements. So some of us have said things like that. Well, that's 1963. So another thing he said was evaluation should not merely, as is now projected, compare the merits of various orthodox programs. I loved it. 63, before many of you were born. And so look at the opportunity to do evaluations that are not necessarily media comparisons, as Dr. Clark has talked about and others here, but really look at what makes a program successful, what needs to be done to help learning. And of course, the field really boomed in the 50s and 60s with the ESEA Act, with Sputnik. There was a fear in the country that, oh my gosh, we're not doing well in terms of educating students, and we better collect data about how we're doing. So we have Scriven in 67, Stake in 67, Eisner with a slightly different perspective on evaluation, the UCLA evaluation group, of which Popham was a part. And we got into the accountability movements, and there was a lot of emphasis on quantitative data. As some of you've heard in other sessions, obviously here already, now there's really a transformation in the field of evaluation to also include a lot of qualitative data. So what do people say? What is their performance? But if you find out what they say or what they're doing, and let's say their performance is bad, what they say and what they're doing is going to help you fix things and help you improve. So qualitative data, sometimes that's the sole focus. Many of us do more mixed methods work. And of course, there's now an emphasis on design-based research, which is more out of the learning sciences, but has many methodologies which we can use in evaluation as well. Ritchie and Klein's design and development research, educational design research, for example, the Plumb book that came out of Holland. So now one of the trends, where are we headed? One is complexity and scale. So for example, on the Engineering Research Center project, I built the first logic model, and we didn't have an evaluator in the beginning, so of course I said we needed an sort of external evaluator. We were allowed to use one at the university, but at first we built our educational evaluation. And that project is a National Engineering Research Center. It was the biggest grant in civil engineering apparently there's ever been. There are 19 engineering research centers normally in operation. It's been going for 30 years. They're all across universities. So we're collecting data across 4 universities on summer programs for undergraduates, K-12 students who are in our center in the summer, thousands of K-12 kids who are in our outreach programs. And we have an evaluator now who's helped us build really innovative methods. So kids come and play a game which actually collects our evaluation data anonymously as they're running through the center and doing interactive events. We also, of course, are evaluating our undergraduate programs, our graduate courses, and we're in the next phase. We've had 4.5 years of funding. In our next phase, we're also evaluating and building professional engineering education. So that's a little example of sort of the scale that evaluation can be on. When we work in evaluation, we're often thinking of the individual, but since you're trying to help someone make decisions about the effectiveness or what can be improved about an instructional program or course, or even you could evaluate an entire graduate program, which a lot of us have done, or a university. So you're looking at complexity and scale now to a great degree. So that's a few minutes of many years. So, thank you very much.